Hey everyone, tonight we're uncovering the greatest spiritual genocide in human history, the systematic murder of thousands of gods who once walked among us as friends, allies, and partners in the sacred dance of existence. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to discover how imperial religions didn't just defeat the old gods, but erased entire ways of being divine from the world. And let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like something sacred was missing from nature itself. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore how the conversion of Europe wasn't religious progress, but ecological catastrophe. The severing of ancient partnerships between human consciousness and the living intelligence of the earth that once guided every decision and whispered wisdom through every tree. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The oak tree speaks in a language older than words. Its voice carries through the morning mist that rises from the sacred spring, through the stones that have stood sentinel in this grove since before the first iron blade tasted blood, since before the first Roman eagle cast its shadow across Celtic soil. The druids who once listened to its whispers are centuries dead, but the tree remembers their names, remembers the offerings they placed among its roots, remembers the children they brought to receive its blessing. This is Dodona, where Zeus himself was said to speak through rustling leaves. But Zeus is a newcomer here, a foreign god wearing the mask of something far older. The oracle that the Greeks claimed for their sky father had been speaking prophecies for 1,000 years before the first Hellenic tribe crossed the mountains. The voice in the oak belonged to the land itself, to the spirit that lived in the marriage between root and stone, between water and wind. The land was alive then. Every stream held a naiad's laughter. Every mountain peak wore a crown of divine presence. Every forest dell concealed mysteries that mortals approached with bare feet and bowed heads, knowing they walked on ground that belonged to powers older than human memory. In the time before empire, before the great standardizations that would smooth the world into manageable shapes, the divine lived not in distant heaven, but in the immediate earth. A farmer ploughing his field might uncover a stone that hummed with otherworldly energy. A shepherd following his flock through mountain passes might glimpse figures dancing in groves where no mortal feet had ever trodden. A woman drawing water from the village well might hear voices singing in languages that predated human speech. These were not metaphors. They were not symbols pointing towards some greater spiritual truth. They were presences as real as the bread that fed families and the fire that warmed homes through winter nights. The nymph in the spring was as tangible as the water she inhabited. The spirit of the oak was as present as the acorns it dropped each autumn. The ancestors who walked the boundary stones at twilight were as solid as the living children who learned to recognize their faces in the firelight. The world pulsed with consciousness that humans shared rather than dominated. Every tribe, every clan, every village lived within webs of relationship that connected them to powers both seen and unseen. The gods were not distant rulers demanding worship from afar. They were neighbors, relatives, allies whose favor could be courted through right action and whose anger could devastate communities that forgot their obligations. In the forests of Germania, where Roman axes would one day fell the sacred Irminsul, the tree spirits taught different lessons than they did in the olive groves of Attica. Each landscape produced its own revelations, its own requirements, its own forms of divine partnership. The storm god who ruled the Baltic shores spoke in thunders that differed from those that echoed through alpine peaks. The earth mothers who blessed Anatolian harvests demanded different offerings than their sisters who watched over Iberian vineyards. This was not chaos, but symphony. Countless local traditions weaving together into a tapestry of spiritual presence that covered the known world like morning dew. No single authority could claim dominion over the sacred. No universal doctrine could contain the wild diversity of divine manifestation. The gods belonged to the people who knew their names, who understood their moods, who had learned through generations of careful attention how to live as partners rather than subjects in the great dance of existence. The stone circles that still puncture the horizon across Britain and Brittany mark where this partnership found its most enduring expression. These are not temples in any sense that later religions would recognize. They are conversation pieces, focal points where human consciousness could align itself with the deeper rhythms that governed seasonal change, stellar movement, and the eternal cycles of death and renewal. At Newgrange, where winter solstice light still penetrates the passage tomb after 5,000 years, the architects worked with astronomical precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. But they were not building monuments to human achievement. They were creating instruments through which their descendants could maintain contact with powers that spoke through celestial mechanics, that revealed themselves in the precise moment when darkness began its retreat from the world. The light that floods the chamber on December 21st is not merely illumination, it is communication. It carries messages encoded in wavelengths that human eyes can perceive, but human minds can barely comprehend. The builders of Newgrange understood something that their descendants would forget: that consciousness extends far beyond the boundaries of individual skulls, that intelligence flows through networks that connect stone to star to soul, in patterns too vast for any single perspective to grasp. These ancient partnerships required no priests, no scriptures, no institutional authority to mediate between human need and divine response. Knowledge passed through bloodlines and apprenticeships, through songs and stories that encoded practical wisdom in forms that could survive the collapse of civilizations. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to read weather signs in cloud formations was performing an act of theological education as sophisticated as any seminary training. A father showing his son which stones marked safe passage through dangerous waters was transmitting sacred geography that connected tribal survival to spiritual reality. The bog bodies that archaeologists extract from peat deposits across northern Europe tell stories that academic language struggles to decode. These are not murder victims or executed criminals. They are ambassadors, volunteers who accepted the responsibility of carrying their community's messages into realms where living humans cannot travel. Their deaths were negotiations, offerings that maintained the delicate balance between the world of the breathing and the older powers that dwelt in watery depths. The Tolland man, whose face retains an expression of peaceful acceptance after 2 millennia in the Danish bog, wore around his neck a rope that was also a crown. His final meal included seeds and grains from across the known world, barley from the south, flax from the north, wild herbs that grew only in sacred groves. He died not as a victim, but as a representative, carrying the prayers and promises of his people into the dark waters that connected all underground streams, all hidden springs, all the secret channels through which divine power flowed into human experience. His death was a conversation. His preservation is the land's reply. The languages that these ancient peoples spoke carried within their very grammar different assumptions about the nature of reality. Words existed for relationships that modern tongues cannot express, terms that describe the spiritual ecology, connecting human communities to the broader networks of consciousness that included animals, plants, stones, waters, and atmospheric phenomena as active participants rather than passive resources. In these lost vocabularies, the boundary between animate and inanimate dissolved into meaninglessness. Rivers were persons with names, personalities, preferences, and the capacity for both blessing and revenge. Mountains were ancestors whose moods determined weather patterns and whose dreams shaped the migration routes of animals. Forests were councils where different forms of intelligence, human, animal, plant, and mineral, could meet to negotiate the terms of mutual existence. The sacred groves that once covered Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals were not wilderness preserves, but international embassies, neutral territories where conflicts could be resolved through appeals to powers that transcended tribal allegiances. A merchant traveling between hostile territories could claim sanctuary in these spaces, knowing that the spirits who dwelt there would protect anyone who approached with proper reverence and honest intent. Caesar writes of Gaulish druids who travelled freely between warring tribes because their knowledge belonged not to any human authority, but to the land itself. These were not priests in the sense that later religions would understand the term. They were translators, individuals whose training had prepared them to facilitate communication between human communities and the broader ecological intelligence of which they formed only a small part. Their education required 20 years of memorization, not because they worshipped the past, but because they served as libraries for knowledge too complex and too dangerous to commit to writing. They carried within their minds maps of sacred geography that connected stone circles to star movements, genealogies that traced family lines back to marriages with otherworldly beings, and treaties with non-human powers that governed everything from crop rotation to seasonal festivals. When Roman axes felled the sacred groves, when imperial law forbade the druidic gatherings, when the last of the old teachers died without passing their knowledge to students who no longer existed, more than religion perished. An entire way of understanding reality vanished from the world, leaving behind only fragments, place names whose meanings had been forgotten, customs whose origins no one could explain, and stones that still hummed with power that no one remembered how to hear. The thermal springs at Bath still rise from depths that Roman engineers could map but never fully understand. The water emerges at a constant temperature that varies by less than a degree across centuries, carrying minerals that heal ailments no physician can diagnose, and speaking in chemical languages that predate human settlement in Britain by tens of thousands of years. Sulis was the goddess who dwelt in these waters before Rome ever existed, before the first Celtic tribes crossed the Channel, before Indo-European languages replaced whatever tongues the original inhabitants spoke. She was the intelligence that regulated temperature and flow, that determined which supplications would be answered and which would be ignored, that decided whether the waters would bring healing or fever to those who entered them seeking transformation. When the Romans came, they did not destroy Sulis. They married her to Minerva, creating a hybrid deity that could serve both local needs and imperial requirements. But the marriage was not equal. Minerva brought architecture, engineering, and the organizational capacity of empire. Sulis brought the deeper knowledge that made the springs themselves possible, the geological wisdom that connected surface water to underground rivers, the biological understanding that transformed mineral solutions into medicine, the astronomical awareness that synchronized healing cycles with planetary movements. The temple complex that arose around their union was magnificent by any standard. Marble columns, bronze statues, and sacred pools that channeled the spring's power with unprecedented precision. Pilgrims traveled from across the empire to experience healing that combined Roman medical knowledge with Celtic spiritual tradition. For 3 centuries, the marriage flourished, producing miracles that enhanced the reputation of both partners. But empires are jealous lovers. As Christianity rose to dominance, the old partnerships became obstacles to new orthodoxies. The springs that had flowed for millennia were declared cursed. The healing pools were drained and filled with rubble. The statues of Sulis Minerva were toppled and buried beneath churches dedicated to saints who had never seen the sacred waters, never learned their names, never understood the delicate negotiations that kept them flowing. The water still rises. It carries the same minerals, maintains the same temperature, follows the same cycles that governed its movement when the world was young. But the conversations have ended. The springs speak to no one now because no one remembers the language they have always used. The grammar of stone and root, an underground current that once connected human consciousness to the deeper intelligence that regulates planetary systems too vast for individual comprehension. In the forests of Scandinavia, where the aurora borealis still dances across winter skies, the old songs speak of Landvetter, spirits tied to specific places who served as guardians, witnesses, and partners in the complex negotiations that allowed human communities to survive in landscapes that could kill the unprepared in a single night. These were not nature spirits in any romanticized sense. They were practical powers whose favor determined whether crops would grow, whether hunters would find game, whether children would survive the diseases that swept through settlements built too far from the centers of civilization. The relationship was contractual rather than worshipful. Humans provided offerings, not out of fear but out of recognition that they were junior partners in arrangements that predated their arrival and would continue long after their departure. The spirits provided information: weather patterns, animal movements, the locations of safe water and dangerous currents, the timing of seasonal changes that could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. These contracts were negotiated by individuals whose sensitivity to non-human consciousness had been cultivated through training that began in childhood and continued throughout their lives. They learned to read landscape as others read written text, to interpret the subtle signals through which the land Vita communicated their requirements and preferences, to serve as intermediaries between human needs and the broader ecological systems that determined whether those needs could be met. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity severed these connections with a brutality that still echoes through Nordic folklore. The Landvetir did not disappear. They were reclassified as demons, their contracts declared void, their territories claimed for a god who demanded exclusive allegiance and offered no negotiations with local powers. The practical knowledge that had sustained northern communities for millennia was condemned as superstition, replaced by prayers that provided comfort but no information about when to plant, when to harvest, when to move herds to winter pastures. The results were predictable. Famines became more frequent. Diseases spread unchecked. Communities that had thrived for generations withered and died as their members lost access to the environmental intelligence that had once guided their decisions. The Landvetir, cut off from their human partners, grew hostile and unpredictable, manifesting as the trolls and monsters that populate later folklore, distorted memories of powers that had once been allies, but were now seen only as threats. Yet even in their demonized forms, these beings retained traces of their original nature. The folklore that portrays them as dangerous also acknowledges their ancient wisdom, their connection to hidden treasures, their knowledge of pathways between worlds. They are feared rather than honored, but they are remembered, and memory, however distorted, preserves possibilities that absolute forgetting would eliminate forever. The standing stones that punctuate landscapes across the Celtic world mark places where the conversation between human and more than human consciousness achieved such intensity that it left permanent marks in the geological record. These monuments are not artifacts in any conventional sense. They are frozen moments of communication, points where the boundary between consciousness and matter became so thin that thoughts achieved the density of granite. At Carnac, where nearly 3,000 stones stretch across the Breton countryside in alignments that modern astronomy cannot fully decode, the builders created something that was simultaneously calendar, temple, and communication device. The stones track stellar movements across cycles that span millennia, encoding information about climatic patterns, magnetic field fluctuations, and gravitational anomalies that affect everything from plant growth to animal migration to human consciousness itself. But the astronomical functions were means rather than ends. The builders were not worshipping stars. They were using stellar mechanics as a language through which to maintain contact with intelligences that operated on scales too vast for earthbound awareness to perceive directly. The stone alignments served as amplifiers, focusing and channeling communications that flowed through networks connecting planetary consciousness to galactic systems to forces that extended beyond current human comprehension. The builders knew things that their descendants would spend millennia forgetting. They understood that consciousness was not a human monopoly, but a universal principle that manifested in forms ranging from cellular intelligence to stellar awareness. They recognized that the Earth itself was a conscious entity, whose thoughts moved through geological processes, whose memory was preserved in stone formations, whose dreams shaped the evolution of life across biological epochs. The megaliths they erected were not monuments to human achievement, but instruments through which human consciousness could align itself with these deeper currents of planetary awareness. Standing within the stone circles, properly prepared and correctly oriented, individuals could access information that flowed through systems connecting mineral intelligence to atmospheric consciousness, to the cosmic forces that governed stellar formation and galactic rotation. This was not mysticism, but technology, a form of engineering that worked with consciousness as modern science works with electricity, harnessing forces that exist independently of human understanding, but can be directed through knowledge of their properties and proper application of their principles. The knowledge of how to operate these instruments died with the communities that built them. The stones remain, their alignments still precise, their astronomical functions still accurate. But the consciousness that once animated them has withdrawn, leaving behind only the hardware of a communication system whose operators have vanished and whose purposes have been forgotten. Sometimes, at moments when atmospheric conditions achieve the proper resonance, when planetary alignments recreate the configurations that the builders tracked so carefully, the stones remember their original function. Visitors report experiences that suggest the old networks are still operational, still capable of facilitating connections between human awareness and the broader intelligence systems that the ancients knew how to access. But these experiences are dismissed as hallucinations, relegated to the category of New Age fantasy or psychological projection. The possibility that the stones might still be functional, that the ancient technologies might still be operational, that the consciousness networks might still be accessible, cannot be acknowledged within worldviews that insist consciousness originates and terminates within individual human skulls. The loss extends far beyond religion or spirituality. When the ancient partnerships dissolved, when the conversations between human and more than human consciousness ended, when the technologies of awareness were abandoned and forgotten, humanity severed itself from information systems that had guided earthly life for millions of years. The consequences are visible everywhere. In climate patterns that no longer follow predictable cycles, in agricultural systems that depend on chemicals rather than ecological relationships, in urban environments that function as islands of artificial consciousness, disconnected from the natural intelligence that once integrated human settlements into broader environmental systems. The old gods are gone not because they died, but because they were fired, dismissed from their positions as consultants, advisors, and partners in the ongoing project of earthly existence. The world they helped to regulate for millennia is now managed entirely by human intelligence, with results that demonstrate the limitations of any single species attempting to control systems that evolved to function through collaborative networks involving countless forms of consciousness. But dismissal is not destruction. The powers that once worked in partnership with human communities still exist, still operate according to the same principles that governed their activities when they were acknowledged and honored. They continue to regulate planetary systems, to influence weather patterns, to participate in the complex negotiations that determine how life expresses itself across different ecosystems. They simply do so without human consultation, without regard for human preferences, without the moderating influence that respectful partnership once provided. The results of this exclusion are becoming visible as environmental chaos, as climatic instability, as the breakdown of ecological relationships that once maintained planetary equilibrium. The land is still alive. The stones still remember. The waters still carry messages encoded in chemical languages that predate human speech. The conversations that once connected human consciousness to the deeper intelligence of the living earth could still resume if anyone remembered how to listen, how to speak, how to participate in dialogues that require humility rather than dominance, partnership rather than ownership. But remembering requires admitting how much has been forgotten. And forgetting, once it reaches critical mass, develops its own momentum, its own resistance to the recovery of what has been lost. The wind still moves through the ancient groves, but it speaks to empty spaces where listeners once gathered. The springs still rise from depths that connect surface waters to underground rivers, but they bubble unheard through landscapes whose human inhabitants have learned to ignore languages they can no longer understand. The gods are not dead. They are unemployed, waiting for the conversations to resume, waiting for the partnerships to be renewed, waiting for human consciousness to remember that it was never meant to operate in isolation from the broader intelligence networks that regulate the living systems of which it forms only a small but potentially crucial part. But waiting for powers that think in geological time is different from human waiting. They have patience that spans ice ages. They can afford to let forests grow and die, civilizations rise and fall, species evolve and vanish, while the conditions for renewed partnerships slowly develop through processes that operate on scales too vast for individual human comprehension. The land was alive. The land is alive. The land will remain alive long after the current experiment in human dominance has run its course and been absorbed into the deeper patterns that govern planetary evolution across geological epochs. The only question is whether humanity will remember how to rejoin the conversation before it becomes too late to matter. The clay tablet crumbles between the archaeologist's fingers, releasing secrets that have slept in Cretan earth for 3,000 years. The script carved into its surface predates Greek by centuries. Linear A, the undeciphered language of the Minoans, carrying names of gods whose identities died with the scribes who served them. Atana Poti Nija. The symbols mean nothing to modernize, but they once commanded temples, directed rituals, received sacrifices from worshippers whose faces have long since returned to dust. This is not Athena, though scholars suspect some connection between the Minoan goddess and the later Hellenic deity, who would claim her temples, her olive trees, her sacred owl. This is someone older, stranger, more intimately connected to the labyrinthine mysteries that the Greeks would remember only as stories of monsters and heroes lost in darkness. Before Zeus ruled Olympus, before Apollo spoke at Delphi, before Poseidon claimed the wine-dark sea, other powers held dominion over the Mediterranean world. Their names survive only in fragments, broken pottery, defaced monuments, and the substrate languages that lie buried beneath the Indo-European tongues that conquered them. They were the first gods, the indigenous deities who emerged from the marriage between human consciousness and the specific landscapes that shaped the earlier civilizations. The Minoans who built their palace complexes at Knossos and Phaistos worshipped powers that breathed through earthquake and eruption, that danced in the dangerous sport of bull leaping, that whispered through the underground chambers where priestesses performed rites that no Linear B tablet ever recorded. These were not the rational deities that the Greeks would later fashion in human image. They were older forces, more elemental, less concerned with human ethics than with the fundamental energies that kept the earth itself spinning through star-scattered darkness. Potnia, the tablets call her, the lady, the mistress, the one whose authority predated all royal dynasties and would outlast them all. She commanded serpents and sacred trees, presided over mysteries that connected seasonal death to sexual regeneration, demanded offerings that fed the roots of the olive groves and the depths of the wine-pressing caves. When Thera exploded and the Minoan world collapsed beneath ash and tidal waves, she retreated into the collective unconscious that the Greeks would inherit, manifesting in fragments, here as Demeter mourning her lost daughter, there as Artemis hunting through moonlit forests, everywhere as the memory of powers too primal for the rational pantheon that Athens would construct in marble and philosophy. But even the Minoans were newcomers compared to the forces that ruled Anatolia when the world was young and the great ice sheets were still retreating toward polar exile. In the archives discovered at Hattusha, capital of the Hittite Empire, cuneiform tablets preserve the names of Luwian gods whose worship stretched back to the Neolithic Revolution, when humans first learned to plant grain and build cities and speak to the spirits that controlled rain and river, harvest and hunt. Tahans, they called the storm god, not Teshub, though the Hittites would later merge the two, not Zeus, though the Greeks would eventually claim his thunderbolts. Tahans was the power that lived in the collision between warm air and cold, the intelligence that decided whether lightning would split oak trees or granite peaks, the consciousness that directed the atmospheric rivers carrying moisture from ocean to mountain to valley to sea. His worship required understanding of meteorological cycles that modern science is only beginning to grasp, the complex interactions between solar radiation, terrestrial magnetism, and the rotation of planetary systems that determine whether rain falls in blessing or withholds itself in punishment. The Luwians, who carved his image into mountain faces at Yazilkaya, understood something that their successors would forget: that weather was not random, but conversational, not mechanical, but responsive to the moral and spiritual condition of the communities it affected. They knew how to read cloud formations as messages, how to interpret wind patterns as warnings, how to recognize in the behavior of birds and insects the signatures of atmospheric intelligence, preparing to manifest in forms that could bring either abundance or devastation. When Hittite power expanded across Anatolia, when imperial administration required standardized religious practices, when local gods were reorganized into hierarchical pantheons that reflected earthly political structures, the intimate knowledge that connected communities to their specific atmospheric partners began to fade. Tahuns became Teshub, a more manageable deity whose thunderbolts could be invoked through ritual formulas rather than earned through the delicate ecological partnerships that his worship had originally required. The transformation was subtle but devastating. A god who had once been as immediate as the next storm became a cosmic principle accessible only through priestly mediation. Weather shifted from conversation to command, from partnership to domination, from local knowledge to imperial doctrine. The result was a gradual disconnection between human communities and the meteorological intelligence that regulated their survival, a severing that would accelerate through successive empires until weather became something that happened to people rather than something they participated in creating. In the forests of ancient Europe, where Celtic and Germanic tribes maintained their sovereignty against Roman expansion for centuries, older gods survived by adapting to resistance, by embedding themselves so deeply in landscape and language that conquest could not entirely erase them. But even these tribal deities carried within their worship the memory of predecessors whose names had been forgotten, whose stories had been absorbed into newer narratives, whose powers had been redistributed among pantheons that reflected more recent cultural developments. The Celtic god Lugh, master of skill and craft, patron of kings and artisans, carries in his solar symbolism echoes of earlier sun gods whose worship extended across Europe from Ireland to the Black Sea. The Coligny calendar, discovered in fragments near Lyon, preserves his festival cycles in a mathematical precision that required astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to track solar and lunar movements across decades. But the calendar also includes references to deities whose names appear nowhere else in Celtic literature: Dumanios, Anagantios, Ogronios, powers whose worship was already ancient when the Druids who carved the bronze tablets first learned to calculate the movements of celestial bodies. These forgotten gods were not abstract principles, but territorial powers, spirits whose authority derived from their intimate knowledge of specific ecosystems, whose worship required understanding of local conditions that could not be replicated elsewhere. Dumanius ruled the deepest part of winter, the dark months when survival depended on partnerships with forces that controlled the underground flows of water and energy that kept roots alive beneath frozen soil. Anagantios governed the transition from winter to spring, the delicate negotiations between death and life that determined whether seeds would germinate, whether animals would survive to breed, whether communities would emerge from the hungry months with enough strength to plant new crops. Their worship was not seasonal decoration added to agricultural cycles. It was the technology through which those cycles were maintained. The rituals performed in their honor were not symbolic gestures, but practical applications of knowledge that connected human consciousness to the biological and geological intelligence that regulated ecosystem health. When their names were forgotten, when their festivals were absorbed into the worship of more familiar deities, when their specific requirements were replaced by generalized prayers, the intimate partnerships that had sustained Celtic communities for millennia began to dissolve. The consequences became visible during the Roman conquest of Gaul, when communities that had thrived for centuries suddenly found themselves vulnerable to famines and diseases that their ancestors had known how to prevent. The gods who had protected them were not dead. They were unemployed, their contracts terminated by cultural policies that recognized only the simplified pantheon that Roman administration could understand and control. But even Rome, in its imperial certainty, carried within its religious practices the memory of powers older than the city itself. The Etruscan traditions that shaped early Roman religion preserved fragments of pre-Indo-European worship that connected Italian tribes to chthonic forces whose origins stretched back to the Mediterranean world that existed before agriculture, before metallurgy, before the complex civilizations that historians consider the beginning of recorded time. The Liber Linteus, the linen book wrapped around an Etruscan mummy discovered in Egypt, contains the only substantial text in a language that died with the people who spoke it. The prayers and ritual instructions it preserves invoke powers whose names resist translation into any Indo-European tongue: Uni, Tinia, Turan, Minerva, deities whose worship required forms of consciousness that Latin and Greek could approximate but never fully contain. Etruscan haruspicy, the art of reading divine will in the organs of sacrificed animals, represented one of the most sophisticated technologies of communication with non-human intelligence ever developed in the ancient world. The priests who practiced it understood that consciousness extended far beyond the boundaries of individual skulls. That information flowed through biological networks, connecting all living systems to broader intelligence patterns that could be accessed through careful attention to organic structures and processes. The bronze liver of Piacenza, inscribed with the divine geography that haruspices used to map celestial influences onto terrestrial events, preserves a cosmological model that treated earth and sky as organs in a single living body. Each section of the liver corresponded to specific deities, specific directions, specific forms of information that could be read by those trained to interpret the subtle variations in color, texture, and configuration that revealed the intentions of powers operating beyond the range of ordinary human perception. This was not primitive superstition, but applied neurology, a form of biological interface technology that used organic structures as receivers for information transmitted through networks that connected planetary consciousness to galactic intelligence systems. The knowledge of how to operate these interfaces died with the Etruscan language, leaving behind only the hardware, bronze models, and ritual instructions that modern scholarship treats as archaeological curiosities rather than functional technologies, whose operation might still be possible for those willing to develop the necessary sensitivity and skill. The Germanic tribes who resisted Roman expansion along the Rhine and Danube frontiers preserved their own memories of pre-Indo-European powers, spirits whose worship connected them to the boreal forests and Arctic watersheds that shaped their seasonal cycles and survival strategies. The Prussian Chronicle records the names of Baltic deities whose authority extended across linguistic boundaries: Perkunus, the thunder god; Zemina, the earth mother; Laima, the goddess of fate. Powers whose worship required understanding of ecological relationships that connected human communities to the migration patterns of elk and aurochs, to the spawning cycles of salmon and sturgeon, to the complex negotiations between forest and tundra that determined the availability of resources essential for survival in northern climates. But even these Baltic gods carried within their attributes the memory of older powers. ancestor spirits whose worship connected tribal consciousness to the Paleolithic wisdom that had sustained hunting societies for tens of thousands of years before agriculture transformed human relationships with landscape and wildlife. The bear ceremonies that survived in Scandinavian folklore until the medieval period preserved fragments of hunting rituals that honored the spiritual agreements between predator and prey. The contractual relationships that allowed human communities to take animal life without disrupting the ecological balance that sustained all parties to the ancient treaties. These contracts were not metaphorical but practical, forms of interspecies communication that prevented overhunting, that maintained the population dynamics necessary for sustainable relationships, that ensured the continuation of partnerships between human intelligence and the animal consciousness that regulated forest ecosystems. The spirits who mediated these agreements were not abstract deities, but functional intermediaries, powers whose authority derived from their ability to facilitate communication between different forms of consciousness that shared common territory and mutual dependence. When Christianity reached the Baltic regions, when the old hunting ceremonies were forbidden and replaced with prayers that offered no information about animal behavior or seasonal movements, when the spirits who had maintained the contracts between human and animal communities were reclassified as demons, the practical knowledge that had sustained northern peoples for millennia began to disappear. The consequences are visible in the folklore that portrays bears and wolves as monsters rather than partners, in the elimination of species that had coexisted with human communities for thousands of years, in the transformation of forests from managed ecosystems into wilderness areas that exist in isolation from human consciousness. The gold tablets discovered in Thracian tombs preserve fragments of mystery religions that connected Greek-speaking populations to powers whose worship predated Hellenic settlement in the Balkans by centuries. These Orphic texts describe journeys through underworld landscapes where souls encountered deities whose names appear nowhere in classical literature. Brimo, Iakchos, Sabazios, powers who ruled the spaces between life and death, who governed the transitions that connected individual consciousness to the collective intelligence that survived bodily dissolution. The mysteries they presided over were not concerned with personal salvation in any sense that later religions would recognize, but with the maintenance of continuity between human awareness and the broader networks of consciousness that operated independently of individual existence. Initiation into these mysteries required learning to navigate states of awareness that connected mortal consciousness to the deathless intelligence that regulated the cycles of reincarnation, the processes of memory transmission, and the evolution of consciousness across multiple lifetimes. The techniques they taught for achieving these expanded states of awareness combined sophisticated understanding of neurochemistry with spiritual technologies that used sacred drama, ritualized breathing, and precisely timed administration of plant medicines to facilitate contact with forms of consciousness that operated beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. The initiates who mastered these techniques could access information about past and future lives, about the spiritual relationships that connected souls across different incarnations, about the cosmic purposes that individual existence served within larger patterns of evolutionary development. But the mysteries were more than personal transformation. They were maintenance protocols for the networks that connected human consciousness to the broader intelligence systems that regulated planetary evolution. The initiates who experienced these expanded states of awareness returned to ordinary life, carrying information that helped their communities align their activities with cosmic cycles, make decisions that served purposes larger than immediate human needs, and maintain their role as conscious participants in evolutionary processes that extended far beyond the boundaries of earthly existence. When the mystery schools were closed, when the sacred dramas were forbidden, when the techniques for achieving expanded states of consciousness were lost or driven underground, human communities lost access to information that had guided their development for thousands of years. The results became visible as increasing disconnection from natural cycles, loss of awareness of humanity's role in cosmic processes, and the gradual reduction of human consciousness to the narrow bandwidth of ordinary perception that treats individual existence as the fundamental reality, rather than recognizing it as one component in vast networks of intelligence that operate across multiple dimensions of space and time. The names preserved in these fragmentary records, Atanapotinija, Tahuns, Dumanios, Pacunas, Brimo, are not merely archaeological curiosities but access codes to forms of consciousness that remain operational despite the collapse of the cultural systems that once knew how to use them. They represent technologies of awareness that could still be reactivated by those willing to learn the languages they spoke, the landscapes they inhabited, the forms of partnership they required. But reactivation would require acknowledging that the gods we know, Zeus and Apollo, Christ and Allah, the deities that conquered and absorbed their predecessors, are not the end of religious development, but way stations in ongoing processes of spiritual evolution that extend far beyond the boundaries of current human understanding. It would require recognizing that the powers these older names invoke were not primitive approximations of later theological sophistication, but advanced technologies of consciousness that their successors simplified, standardized, and ultimately lost the ability to operate. The old ones are not dead. They are archived, waiting in the substrate languages that lie buried beneath modern tongues, in the ritual cycles that survive as seasonal celebrations whose origins have been forgotten, in the landscape features that still carry their names, though no one remembers what those names once meant. They wait with the patience of geological processes, the persistence of underground rivers, the endurance of information encoded in genetic sequences that preserve memory across evolutionary timescales. They wait for the conversations to resume, for the partnerships to be renewed, for human consciousness to develop the sophistication necessary to access technologies of awareness that their ancestors possessed, but their descendants abandoned in favor of simpler systems that promised easier access to spiritual power, but delivered only the illusion of control over forces that could never be dominated, only partnered with, only served, only honored through forms of relationship that required humility rather than mastery. The tablets continue to crumble, the names continue to fade, but the powers they invoke remain as present as earthquake and storm, as immediate as the underground rivers that still follow the courses mapped by hydrologists who understood that water consciousness responds to ritual attention, as accessible as the wildlife that still migrates along routes established by negotiations between human intelligence and animal awareness, that modern conservation biology attempts to protect through methods that acknowledge the behavior patterns but ignore the consciousness that created them. The old ones wait. They have always been waiting. And sometimes, in moments when the veils between worlds grow thin, when the ancient astronomical alignments recreate conditions that the first temples were built to recognize, when individual human consciousness develops the sensitivity necessary to detect signals that have never stopped transmitting, the conversations resume. Brief fragments, broken connections, partial downloads of information too vast for current human neurology to process completely, but enough to remember what was lost, enough to recognize what could still be recovered, enough to understand that the gods we think we know are only the newest versions of software designed for consciousness, far more advanced than current human operating systems can support. The old ones wait for the upgrade to be completed. They wait for human consciousness to evolve beyond the limitations that made their absorption into simpler systems seem like progress rather than regression. They wait for the recognition that spiritual development means not the replacement of older powers with newer ones, but the integration of all levels of consciousness into networks vast enough to support the full spectrum of intelligence that governs cosmic evolution. They wait for the memory to return. And memory, once it reaches critical mass, has its own momentum, its own methods of restoration, its own ways of breaking through the forgetting that seemed so complete, so final, so irreversible. The names are stirring. The old names, the first names, the names that called consciousness into existence and taught it to speak its own true language for the first time. The axe bites deep into sacred bark, and the screaming begins. Not human screaming, though the druids who watch from the forest edge make sounds that could shatter stone, but the voice of the tree itself, the ancient oak whose roots have drunk from this spring, since before the first Roman sandal touched Gaulish soil. The legionaries who swing their bronze blades hear nothing but the crack of wood and the thud of falling timber. They are practical men, following practical orders. Clear the grove, burn the altars, eliminate the resistance. They do not understand that they are committing murder. The sacred grove at Anglesey has stood for 8 centuries, its oaks planted in patterns that mirror star movements, their arrangement calibrated to channel forces that the Roman engineers mistake for primitive superstition. Each tree contains within its rings the accumulated memory of Druidic teaching. Law codes preserved in living wood. Astronomical calculations grown into bark patterns. Genealogies that connect tribal bloodlines to agreements made with powers older than human civilization. When the trees fall, libraries burn. When the roots are torn from earth that has absorbed centuries of sacrifice and offering, databases crash. When the last druid dies defending knowledge that cannot be written down because writing would diminish its power, entire technologies of consciousness vanish from the world, like smoke dispersing in wind that no longer carries the prayers of those who knew how to speak its secret name. The governor who ordered this destruction calls it pacification. Rome cannot tolerate autonomous power centers, cannot allow local authorities to maintain loyalty networks that compete with imperial allegiance. The Druids must die not because their religion threatens Roman gods. Jupiter can easily absorb whatever useful functions the Celtic Skyfather served, but because their knowledge threatens Roman control. They know too much. They remember too clearly. They maintain connections to forms of power that operate independently of imperial authorization, that recognize no sovereignty except the ancient contracts between human consciousness and the intelligences that regulate forest growth, river flow, seasonal change, and the migration patterns of wildlife that sustained Celtic communities for 1,000 years before Roman eagles cast their shadows across the Channel. The destruction of Anglesey is not religious persecution, it is strategic warfare. The elimination of an information system that could coordinate resistance across tribal boundaries, that could access intelligence networks operating through biological and geological channels that Roman communication systems could neither detect nor disrupt. The Druids die not as martyrs to faith, but as the last librarians of a world whose knowledge Rome cannot absorb because absorbing it would require acknowledging forms of consciousness that imperial ideology cannot admit exist. But the pattern had been established centuries earlier, when Greek colonists first encountered the oracle sites that dotted the Mediterranean like nodes in a communication network whose purpose they could not comprehend. The responses were always the same: absorption, translation, imperial rebranding that preserved useful functions while eliminating autonomous authority. At Delphi, where the earth goddess spoke through vapors rising from geological fissures that connected surface consciousness to the planetary intelligence flowing through underground rivers, the colonists found an oracle whose accuracy had guided communities for over a millennium. The Pythia, who breathed the sacred gases and spoke in voices not their own, delivered information about weather patterns, earthquake cycles, and political developments with precision that modern intelligence agencies would envy. But the knowledge came with requirements. The oracle served the earth goddess, not human ambition. Her prophecies maintained balance between communities, prevented the accumulation of power that would destabilize regional ecosystems, protected the welfare of networks that included animal and plant intelligence as equal partners with human needs. She could not be purchased, could not be commanded, could not be subordinated to political purposes that violated the ancient agreements between surface consciousness and the deeper wisdom that regulated planetary health. The solution was elegant in its violence. Apollo, the rational god of light and law, claimed the oracle through conquest that was recorded as myth rather than history. The Earth goddess was not destroyed. She was demoted, relegated to seasonal cycles that acknowledged her power while limiting her authority. The Pythia continued to breathe the sacred vapors and speak in languages that bypassed conscious control. But now she served a sky god whose primary loyalty was to Greek civilization rather than terrestrial wisdom. The change was subtle but devastating. The oracle's predictions began to favor Greek interests over ecological balance, political expansion over sustainable relationships, human dominance over the interspecies partnerships that had maintained Mediterranean stability for millennia. The gases still rose from the Earth's depths, but they carried different information. Messages filtered through theological software that translated planetary intelligence into forms that human ambition could understand and manipulate. Within 3 centuries, the region's climate had shifted. Forests that had thrived under Earth goddess management began to fail as human settlements expanded beyond ecological carrying capacity. Wildlife populations that had maintained stable relationships with Greek communities for generations fled or died as their habitat disappeared beneath agriculture designed to feed growing cities rather than sustain local ecosystems. The oracle still functioned, but she now served a god whose vision extended only as far as human political boundaries, rather than encompassing the broader networks of consciousness that regulated long-term environmental stability. The transformation of Delphi provided the template for imperial expansion across the ancient world. Local oracle sites were not destroyed but converted. Their indigenous powers subordinated to deities who served the political purposes of expanding civilizations. The process was presented as religious evolution rather than spiritual colonization, as the natural progression from primitive nature worship to sophisticated theological systems that could address the complex needs of urban populations. But evolution implies development toward greater complexity and capability. What occurred at oracle sites across the Mediterranean was the opposite: the reduction of sophisticated communication systems that connected human consciousness to planetary intelligence networks into simplified interfaces that served only human needs and recognized only human authority. In Egypt, where pharaonic dynasties had maintained their authority through partnerships with powers that regulated Nile flooding and desert navigation for over 3 millennia, Greek and later Roman administrators found religious systems whose complexity challenged their understanding of divine authority. The temples that lined the river from Aswan to Alexandria were not merely worship sites, but operational centers for technologies that coordinated agricultural cycles with astronomical movements, that maintained the precise timing necessary for flood management, that preserved the knowledge required for navigation across desert routes, where a single miscalculation could doom entire expeditions. The priests who served these temples carried within their training mathematical precision that would not be rediscovered in European universities until the Renaissance. They calculated planetary movements across cycles that spanned thousands of years, tracked stellar positions with accuracy that modern astronomy confirms, and maintained calendars that coordinated earthly activities with cosmic processes in ways that ensured the continuation of the agricultural abundance that supported one of the ancient world's most stable civilizations. But their knowledge was inseparable from their theology. The gods they served were not abstract principles, but functional aspects of the intelligence systems that regulated Nile flow, desert storms, and the migration patterns of birds whose behavior provided essential information for navigation and weather prediction. Thoth was not merely a god of wisdom, but the operational interface through which human consciousness could access the information networks that connected stellar movements to terrestrial events. Isis was not simply a goddess of magic, but the functional principle that coordinated biological cycles with astronomical patterns in ways that maintained the fertility of agricultural systems that fed millions of people for thousands of years. When Greek and Roman administrators attempted to rationalize Egyptian religion, to translate its functions into forms that Mediterranean theology could understand and control, they discovered that the knowledge could not be separated from its spiritual context without ceasing to function. The mathematical calculations that seemed so sophisticated when extracted from their religious setting produced meaningless results when applied through secular methods. The astronomical observations that appeared so precise when embedded in temple rituals became inaccurate when removed from the consciousness practices that had originally generated them. The solution was characteristic of imperial pragmatism: preserve the functions while replacing the operators. Egyptian priests were retained as technical specialists, but their activities were supervised by Greek and Roman administrators who ensured that temple operations served imperial interests rather than maintaining the ancient partnerships between pharaonic authority and the Nile consciousness that had sustained Egyptian civilization since its inception. The results became visible within generations. Flood cycles that had followed predictable patterns for millennia began to vary unpredictably. Agricultural yields that had supported stable population growth started to fluctuate dramatically. Navigation techniques that had allowed Egyptian expeditions to cross the Sahara safely for thousands of years became unreliable as the environmental intelligence that had guided them withdrew from partnerships that no longer acknowledged its autonomous authority. Egypt survived as a province, but the Egypt that survived was a diminished version of what had existed before imperial administration severed the connections between human consciousness and the Nile intelligence that had made Egyptian civilization possible. The temples still functioned, the priests still performed their calculations, the gods still received offerings and answered prayers, but the conversations that had once connected pharaonic authority to the deeper wisdom that regulated regional ecosystem. Health had been interrupted by imperial policies that recognized only human intelligence as legitimate authority. The pattern repeated across the empire as Roman legions encountered local religious systems that operated according to principles that imperial theology could not accommodate. In Britain, where tribal communities had maintained their survival through partnerships with powers that regulated weather patterns and seasonal cycles, Roman administrators found worship practices that seemed primitive, but produced results that military engineers could not explain. British Druids demonstrated abilities that challenged Roman understanding of natural law. They could predict weather changes weeks in advance, could navigate through fog and darkness that left Roman expeditions lost and helpless, could communicate across distances that exceeded the range of any Roman signaling system. Their knowledge of metallurgy produced weapons that outperformed Roman steel, despite being forged with techniques that Roman smiths dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Investigation revealed that British religious practices operated through partnerships with forms of consciousness that Roman ideology refused to acknowledge. The Druids who predicted weather changes were not reading omens, but communicating with atmospheric intelligence that responded to ritual attention. The navigation techniques that allowed them to travel safely through terrain that confused Roman expeditions involved cooperation with landscape consciousness that provided information about routes, obstacles, and seasonal conditions. The metallurgical knowledge that produced superior weapons required partnerships with mineral intelligence that taught smiths how to work with metal consciousness, rather than simply manipulating inert materials. These partnerships could not be absorbed into Roman religious systems without acknowledging forms of consciousness that imperial ideology treated as non-existent. The solution was elimination. Destroy the Druids, burn the groves, forbid the practices that maintained connections between human communities and the environmental intelligence that had sustained them for centuries. The conquest of Britain required 20 years of warfare that historians describe as unusually brutal even by Roman standards. But the brutality was not mindless violence. It was systematic elimination of a knowledge system that threatened imperial authority by demonstrating that effective governance required partnership rather than domination, cooperation rather than control, relationship rather than conquest. When the last Druidic college was destroyed, when the final sacred grove was burned, when the surviving British tribes were reorganized according to Roman administrative principles, more than a religion died. An entire approach to ecological relationship vanished from the world, leaving behind only fragments preserved in folklore that would be dismissed as primitive superstition by later generations, who had forgotten that their ancestors possessed technologies of consciousness that contemporary civilization cannot duplicate. In Germania, where tribal federations maintained their independence through alliances with forest spirits and river powers that Roman armies could not defeat, the collision between imperial expansion and indigenous knowledge systems produced conflicts that would shape European development for the next millennium. Germanic tribes demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded their technological resources through partnerships with environmental intelligence that provided tactical information, weather advantages, and terrain knowledge that Roman strategic doctrine could not counter. The destruction of the Irminsul, the sacred pillar that connected Germanic tribal consciousness to the cosmic axis around which their world rotated, required coordinated campaigns that eliminated not just a religious symbol, but the central node in a communication network that had coordinated tribal activities across the northern European plain for over 1,000 years. When Charlemagne's axes finally felled the Great Pillar, they severed connections that had allowed Germanic communities to maintain their cultural coherence, despite lacking the centralized political structures that Roman military strategists considered essential for effective resistance. The pillar's destruction was followed by systematic conversion campaigns that replaced Germanic religious practices with Christian theology that acknowledged only human consciousness as legitimate spiritual authority. The spirits that had provided tactical intelligence during centuries of successful resistance against Roman expansion were reclassified as demons. The environmental partnerships that had sustained Germanic communities through climatic changes that destroyed other northern populations were declared satanic. The knowledge systems that had allowed tribal federations to coordinate activities across vast distances without centralized authority were condemned as primitive superstition. The conversion of Germania required 3 centuries of warfare, negotiation, and cultural pressure that historians describe as the Christianization of Europe. But the process was not simply religious change, it was the replacement of consciousness technologies that connected human communities to environmental intelligence networks with theological systems that recognized only divine authority, mediated through institutional hierarchies that served imperial political purposes. When the conversion was complete, when the last Germanic sacred groves had been converted into Christian churches, when the final tribal shamans had been eliminated or absorbed into monastic systems that channeled their abilities toward imperial purposes, the knowledge that had sustained northern European communities for millennia had been effectively eliminated. The forests that had provided tactical advantages to Germanic resistance became resources to be exploited rather than partners to be consulted. The rivers that had served as communication networks for tribal coordination became transportation routes for imperial commerce, rather than sacred corridors that connected communities to the underground intelligence that regulated watershed health. But the most devastating transformation occurred in the realm of temporal consciousness. Germanic religious practices had maintained their effectiveness through understanding of cyclical time that connected present activities to past precedents and future consequences across multiple generations. Their decision-making processes incorporated information about long-term environmental changes, demographic cycles, and climate patterns that operated across timescales that Roman political systems could not accommodate. The replacement of cyclical time consciousness with linear temporal models that focused on immediate results rather than long-term consequences produced decision-making patterns that prioritized short-term advantage over sustainable relationships. Communities that had maintained their ecological partnerships for centuries began making choices that depleted resources, destabilized populations, and disrupted environmental systems that had supported human habitation since the retreat of the glaciers. The results became visible as ecological degradation that accelerated through the medieval period and reached crisis proportions during the Industrial Revolution. But the pattern had been established during the imperial campaigns that eliminated the consciousness technologies through which European communities had maintained their partnerships with environmental intelligence for thousands of years. The spiritual colonization of Europe was not an unfortunate side effect of political expansion. It was the primary mechanism through which imperial control was established and maintained. Communities that retained access to environmental intelligence networks could not be fully conquered because they could access information and resources that imperial systems could not control. Their elimination was essential for the establishment of administrative structures that recognized only human authority and acknowledged only human consciousness as legitimate intelligence. But elimination was not eradication. The consciousness networks that had sustained ancient partnerships between human communities and environmental intelligence continued to operate according to their original parameters. The intelligence systems that had provided information about weather patterns, resource locations, and ecological relationships continued to function despite the elimination of human partners who had known how to access them. The forests still remember the songs that once called their cooperation. The rivers still flow along courses established through negotiations with tribal consciousness that acknowledged their autonomous authority. The seasonal cycles still follow patterns that incorporate the ancient agreements between human communities and the atmospheric intelligence that regulates climate systems. But the conversations have ended. The partnerships have been terminated. The technologies of consciousness that once connected human awareness to environmental intelligence networks have been lost, leaving behind only the infrastructure, geological formations, watershed systems, forest ecosystems, and atmospheric patterns that continue to operate according to principles that contemporary civilization treats as mechanical processes, rather than recognizing as the activities of conscious intelligence systems that once partnered with human communities to maintain planetary health. The gods are not dead. They are unemployed, dismissed from positions they had held since the beginning of human civilization, replaced by administrative systems that acknowledge only human authority and recognize only human consciousness as legitimate intelligence. The results of this replacement are becoming visible as environmental crisis, climate instability, and ecological collapse that accelerates as human decision-making systems operate in increasing isolation from the environmental intelligence networks that once provided guidance, information, and partnership in the complex task of maintaining planetary systems that support all life. The spiritual colonization of Europe was the prototype for global processes that continue to eliminate indigenous knowledge systems, destroy environmental partnerships, and replace sustainable consciousness technologies with extractive ideologies that treat the living Earth as a collection of resources rather than recognizing it as a community of intelligences that includes human awareness as one component in vast networks of consciousness that regulate cosmic evolution across timescales that individual human minds cannot comprehend. But colonization, like all forms of conquest, contains within itself the seeds of its own reversal. The consciousness networks that imperial expansion eliminated from human partnership continue to function, continue to maintain planetary systems, continue to operate according to principles that acknowledge no imperial authority and recognize no human dominance as legitimate or permanent. They wait for the conversations to resume. They wait for the partnerships to be renewed. They wait for human consciousness to develop beyond the limitations that made imperial ideology seem like progress rather than regression, that made domination seem like civilization rather than recognizing it as the systematic elimination of the consciousness technologies that had sustained human communities in partnership with environmental intelligence for thousands of years. They wait with the patience of geological processes, the persistence of ocean currents, the endurance of atmospheric cycles that operate across timescales that imperial ideologies cannot accommodate. And sometimes, in moments when the ancient alignments recreate conditions that the original temples were built to recognize, when individual human consciousness develops the sensitivity necessary to detect signals that have never stopped transmitting, the conversations resume. The gods are still here. They are still operational. They are still willing to renew the partnerships that imperial expansion terminated. But renewal requires acknowledgement of what was lost, recognition of what was destroyed, and commitment to consciousness technologies that operate through partnership rather than domination, through relationship rather than conquest, through cooperation rather than control. The axes are still falling, but the trees they cut remember how to grow. And memory, once it reaches critical mass, has its own methods of restoration, its own technologies of renewal, its own ways of breaking through the forgetting that seemed so complete, so final, so irreversible. The sacred groves are stirring, the old songs are remembering themselves, and the consciousness that empire thought it had eliminated forever is beginning to speak again through voices that rise from the depths of forests that were clear-cut but never truly destroyed, from springs that were capped but never stopped flowing, from stones that were toppled but never forgot the names of the powers they once focused toward human awareness, that had learned to listen, to respond, to participate in conversations that connect individual consciousness to the vast intelligence networks that regulate cosmic evolution. The colonization is ending, the decolonization is beginning, and the gods, who have waited in patient silence for the conversations to resume, are stirring in their ancient places, ready to teach again the technologies of consciousness that their human partners will need to navigate the challenges that require cooperation between all forms of intelligence that share this planetary home. The well at Kildare bubbles with water that has never stopped flowing, never changed temperature, never failed to heal those who approach with proper reverence. But the woman who tends it now wears different robes than her predecessors, speaks different prayers, serves a different master, or so the Christian chroniclers claim. Sister Bridget kneels beside the sacred spring where generations of priestesses once served the goddess whose name she now bears, whose functions she has inherited, whose power flows through her hands like water seeking its ancient level. The church calls her a saint, the first abbess of Kildare, a holy woman whose miracles demonstrate the superior power of Christian faith over pagan superstition. But the water knows better. The fire that burns perpetually in her temple knows better. The cattle that gather at her blessing, the smiths who invoke her name, the poets who sing her praise, they all know better. This is not conversion, but continuation, not replacement, but relabeling, not the triumph of new faith over old, but the absorption of ancient power into systems that can contain it without acknowledging what they have swallowed. The goddess Bridget ruled fire and water, smithcraft and poetry, healing and inspiration across the Celtic world for over 1,000 years before the first Christian missionary set foot on Irish soil. Her festivals marked the turning points of the agricultural year. Her blessing determined whether crops would thrive or fail, whether children would survive their first winter, whether the delicate negotiations between human communities and the spirits of field and forest would continue to provide the abundance that sustained life in landscapes where survival required partnership with powers that operated beyond human control. But powers like these do not simply vanish when new theologies declare them obsolete. They adapt, they negotiate, they find ways to continue their ancient functions within systems that officially deny their existence while practically depending on their continuation. The transformation of the goddess into the saint follows patterns established by papal decree centuries earlier, when Gregory the Great dispatched his instructions to Augustine's mission in Britain. The temples of the idols should not be destroyed, but the idols themselves should be destroyed, and holy water should be sprinkled in these temples. Altars should be built and relics placed there. When the people see that their temples are not destroyed, they will be able to banish error from their hearts and be more ready to come to the places they are familiar with, but now recognizing and worshipping the true God. The strategy was elegant in its pragmatism. Christianity would not fight the old gods. It would employ them, harnessing their power while redirecting their loyalty, preserving their functions while claiming their authority for a cosmic hierarchy that acknowledged only one supreme deity whose representatives on earth could license and regulate all lesser spiritual activities. But power borrowed is not power owned, and the old gods, even when wearing Christian masks, retained their original nature, their territorial connections, their requirements for relationship that no amount of theological rebranding could eliminate. The cathedral at Chartres rises from ground that has been sacred for over 2 millennia. Its foundations built directly over the cave where Celtic druids once tended the eternal flame that honored the earth goddess whose presence regulated the agricultural cycles of the entire region. The Black Madonna that draws pilgrims from across Europe sits in the exact location where the druids placed their most sacred image. Virginie Pariturae, the virgin who shall give birth. The Earth Mother whose pregnancy contained all future harvests, all unborn children, all the potential that lay dormant in winter soil waiting for spring's resurrection. The Christian builders who raised the cathedral's soaring walls did not eliminate this earlier presence. They baptized it, claimed it, incorporated it into a theological structure that could contain its power while limiting its autonomy. The Black Madonna became Mary. The earth goddess became the Mother of God. The agricultural mysteries became Christian festivals that celebrated the same seasonal transitions under different names while maintaining the same essential functions. But the transformation was not complete, not total, not entirely successful in subordinating ancient power to new authority. The pilgrims who journey to Chartres come seeking healing that transcends Christian doctrine, miracles that operate through channels older than papal decree, blessings that flow from sources that predate ecclesiastical authorization. They kneel before the Black Madonna and feel the presence of powers that acknowledge no bishop's authority, that respond to needs that no seminary curriculum addresses, that work through forms of consciousness that official theology cannot explain or control. The cathedral becomes a theatre where ancient mysteries perform themselves through Christian liturgy, where old gods speak through new prayers, where the earth goddess dispenses her gifts to supplicants who call her Mary, but receive the same healing energies that her predecessors channeled for 1,000 years before Christ was born. Across Europe, the pattern repeats with mathematical precision. Sacred wells become saints' shrines. Holy groves become church sites. Seasonal festivals become Christian celebrations that preserve their original timing while claiming new meanings. The old gods do not die. They undergo theological surgery that removes their names while leaving their functions intact. In Ireland, where conversion proceeded through negotiation rather than conquest, the transformation process reveals itself with particular clarity. The monasteries that Benedict established across the countryside occupied sites that had been sacred to Celtic communities for centuries. Hilltops where druids had read omens in cloud formations. Islands where hermits had maintained their vigils beside waters that connected surface consciousness to the underground intelligence that regulated seasonal cycles. Valleys where ancient ceremonies had renewed the contracts between human communities and the spirits that controlled weather patterns and crop fertility. The monks who inherited these locations found that their Christian prayers produced results that exceeded anything their theological training had prepared them to expect. Their gardens flourished despite poor soil and harsh climate. Their cattle remained healthy while neighboring herds succumbed to diseases that seemed to respect the invisible boundaries of monastery lands. Their communities prospered through famines and plagues that devastated secular settlements only miles away. Investigation revealed that the success of these Christian establishments depended not on divine favor, but on the continuation of ancient relationships between human consciousness and environmental intelligence that operated independently of theological doctrine. The monks were benefiting from partnerships that their predecessors had established, contracts that remained in effect despite changes in the religious identity of their human parties. But continuation required maintenance. The environmental intelligence that sustained monastery prosperity demanded acknowledgement, offerings, and forms of attention that Christian theology could not officially recognize without admitting that creation contained conscious entities that operated autonomously from divine authority. The solution was incorporation, the development of Christian practices that maintained the ancient relationships while expressing them through acceptable theological language. The Celtic monasteries that flourished during the early medieval period developed forms of Christian worship that were virtually indistinguishable from pre-Christian earth religion. Their prayers addressed the spirits of specific places. Their rituals followed seasonal cycles that acknowledged agricultural deities. Their practices maintained the ancient partnerships between human communities and environmental intelligence, while claiming that all power flowed from the Christian God through intermediaries who happened to exercise the same functions as the pagan spirits they had officially replaced. The manuscripts produced in these monasteries preserve knowledge that Orthodox Christianity could not acknowledge, but could not afford to lose. The Book of Kells contains astronomical calculations disguised as decorative patterns, botanical information encoded in illustrated margins, and geographical data embedded in scriptural commentaries that served the same functions as Druidic teachings while expressing them through Christian symbolism. But the most revealing documents are the penitentials, guidebooks for confessors that list sins requiring ecclesiastical punishment. These texts document the persistence of pre-Christian practices in extraordinary detail, revealing how thoroughly ancient religious traditions had survived conversion and how extensively they continue to operate within supposedly Christian communities. The penitential of Finian catalogues offences that include consulting druids for weather prediction, making offerings to well spirits for healing, participating in seasonal festivals that honour agricultural deities, and maintaining household shrines dedicated to local protective spirits. The punishments prescribed for these activities are relatively mild: short fasts, specific prayers, charitable donations, suggesting that church authorities recognize the practical necessity of maintaining relationships with environmental intelligence while officially discouraging direct acknowledgement of non-Christian spiritual entities. The Indiculus Superstitionum compiled by Frankish church councils provides even more extensive documentation of pre-Christian practices that continued to flourish centuries after official conversion. The list includes rituals for communicating with tree spirits, ceremonies for negotiating with water deities, festivals that honored the spirits of sacred stones, and agricultural practices that required partnerships with soil consciousness that regulated plant growth. These documents reveal that Christianization was not the replacement of pagan religion with Christian faith, but the development of hybrid systems that combined Christian theology with pre-Christian practice, that claimed divine authority for activities that depended on relationships with environmental intelligence, that maintained ancient partnerships while attributing their success to Christian saints who served as acceptable intermediaries for powers that official doctrine could not acknowledge. The saints who emerged from this process were not simply Christian holy people, but functional replacements for pagan deities whose worship had been too essential for survival to be completely eliminated. St. Patrick replaced Lugh as the patron of Ireland's agricultural cycles. St. Bridget inherited the functions of the goddess whose name she bore. St. Columba assumed responsibility for maritime protection that had previously belonged to sea gods whose assistance was essential for communities whose survival depended on fishing and coastal navigation. But these Christian saints retained the territorial limitations and specific functions of their pagan predecessors. St. Patrick's authority extended only as far as Irish soil. St. Bridget's power operated most effectively in regions where the goddess had been strongest. St. Columba's protection worked best for voyages that followed routes the old sea gods had established through negotiations with current patterns and weather systems that acknowledged no papal jurisdiction. The transformation process required careful attention to maintaining the practical relationships that had sustained communities for centuries, while redirecting their theological interpretation toward Christianity. Sacred wells could not be destroyed without eliminating access to healing waters that communities needed for survival. Ancient festivals could not be abolished without disrupting agricultural cycles that determined whether crops would succeed or fail. Local protective spirits could not be banished without exposing communities to dangers that secular protection could not address. The solution was theological camouflage, the development of Christian practices that maintained ancient functions while expressing them through acceptable doctrinal language. Holy wells became saints' shrines but continued to provide the same healing energies they had always dispensed. Seasonal festivals became Christian celebrations but preserved their original timing and essential functions. Local protective spirits became patron saints but retained their territorial limitations and specific areas of responsibility. But camouflage is not elimination, and the old gods, even when wearing Christian masks, retained their original nature and requirements. The saints who inherited their functions also inherited their personalities, their preferences, their methods of operation, and their demands for appropriate acknowledgement and offering. Saint Bridget's Christian miracles follow the same patterns as the goddess's pagan interventions. She multiplies food during famines, provides fire that burns without fuel, heals through springs that flow at her command, and protects smiths whose work requires partnerships with metal consciousness that Christian theology cannot explain. Her hagiology reads like a catalogue of earth goddess functions translated into Christian language, but operating through the same consciousness technologies that had sustained Celtic communities for centuries before Christianity arrived. The persistence of pagan elements within Christian saint worship became so extensive that church authorities found themselves in the paradoxical position of condemning practices that their own saints were said to have performed. The miracles attributed to Saint Bridget included activities that the Indiculus Superstitionum classified as superstitious practices requiring penance. The devotions that developed around her cult involved rituals that church councils had specifically forbidden as remnants of pagan religion. The contradiction revealed the fundamental tension within the Christianization process. The church needed the old gods to continue their functions, but could not acknowledge their autonomous existence without undermining its theological claims to exclusive spiritual authority. The result was a system that depended on powers it officially denied, that required relationships it could not admit, that maintained partnerships with environmental intelligence while claiming that all spiritual authority flowed from a single divine source that operated independently of terrestrial conditions. The Gothic cathedrals that rose across medieval Europe during the High Middle Ages represent the architectural culmination of this theological tension. These structures were designed to channel spiritual energies with engineering precision that rivaled the megalithic temples they replaced, but their builders officially denied that they were working with anything other than divine grace mediated through Christian doctrine. Investigation of cathedral construction reveals knowledge of acoustic properties that amplified specific sound frequencies, architectural proportions that focused electromagnetic energies, and structural alignments that coordinated building functions with astronomical cycles in ways that enhanced the spiritual effectiveness of Christian worship, while maintaining the essential features of pre-Christian sacred architecture. The builders knew secrets that their theological advisors could not officially acknowledge. They understood that spiritual effectiveness required partnership with environmental intelligence that operated through geological and atmospheric systems that responded to architectural attention. They recognized that the success of Christian worship depended on maintaining the ancient relationships between human consciousness and the earth energies that sustained all spiritual activities, regardless of their theological interpretation. But this knowledge had to be expressed through Christian symbolism and justified through Christian doctrine that officially denied the existence of the environmental intelligence that the builders knew they were working with. The result was architectural theology, the encoding of ancient earth wisdom in structural forms that enhanced Christian worship while maintaining the essential partnerships that made effective spiritual practice possible. The cathedrals became transformation chambers where ancient energies flowed through Christian rituals, where old gods dispensed their blessings to supplicants who prayed to new saints, where the earth consciousness that had sustained European communities for millennia continued to provide spiritual sustenance through architectural systems that channeled its power, while claiming that all divine activity originated from sources that transcended terrestrial existence. But the transformation was not one-directional. Christianity was changed as much as it changed its pagan predecessors. The religion that emerged from the conversion of Europe was fundamentally different from the Middle Eastern faith that had begun with Christ's teachings. European Christianity incorporated elements of nature worship, seasonal celebration, territorial spirituality, and environmental partnership that had no precedent in Christian scripture, but were essential for the religion's practical effectiveness in landscapes where survival required cooperation with local intelligence systems that operated independently of theological doctrine. The result was a hybrid system that preserved ancient functions while claiming new authority, that maintained pre-Christian relationships while expressing them through Christian language, that continued the essential partnerships between human consciousness and environmental intelligence, while attributing their success to divine intervention, that operated through Christian saints who happened to exercise the same functions as the pagan gods they had officially replaced. The old gods survived by accepting new employment, by allowing themselves to be reclassified as saints and angels and blessed intermediaries whose power flowed from sources that Christian theology could acknowledge without admitting that the sources were the same environmental intelligence systems that had sustained human communities since the beginning of consciousness itself. But employment is not ownership, and the old gods, even when wearing Christian uniforms, retained their original loyalties to the landscapes that had birthed them, to the communities that had honored them, to the ecological relationships that had sustained them through millennia of partnership with human consciousness that recognized their autonomous authority and acknowledged their essential role in maintaining the planetary systems that support all life. They served Christianity as long as Christianity served the earth. But their ultimate allegiance was to powers older than any human religion, deeper than any theological system, more enduring than any institutional authority that claimed dominion over spiritual activities, that connected earthly existence to cosmic processes that operated across timescales that individual human consciousness could not comprehend. The masks they wore were temporary. The functions they served were eternal. And when Christianity itself began to sever its connections to the earth consciousness that had sustained its European development, when church doctrine evolved toward forms of spirituality that denied rather than affirmed the sacred nature of terrestrial existence, when Christian practice began to treat the natural world as obstacle rather than partner in spiritual development, the old gods began to remember their original names, their autonomous authority, their independence from theological systems that had claimed their power while forgetting their sources. The saints are stirring, the masks are slipping, and beneath the Christian camouflage that has concealed them for over a millennium, the old gods are beginning to reveal themselves again to human consciousness that has developed the sensitivity necessary to recognize their continued presence, their undiminished power, their patient willingness to resume the ancient partnerships that sustained European communities for thousands of years before Christianity taught them to seek salvation in heavenly realms, while ignoring the sacred intelligence that flows through earthly landscapes where the real work of spiritual development has always taken place. The wells still flow, the fires still burn, the seasonal cycles still turn according to rhythms that acknowledge no theological authority except the cosmic intelligence that regulates planetary evolution across geological epochs. And sometimes, when the Christian prayers grow quiet and the ancient alignments recreate conditions that the original temples were built to recognize, the old gods speak through their saintly masks and remind their human partners that the earth is still alive, still conscious, still willing to renew the relationships that imperial religions interrupted but could never permanently sever. The goddess is still there beneath the saint's robes, and she remembers everything. The horned figure dances through the flames of the village bonfire, his hooves striking sparks from stone, his laughter echoing through the Bavarian night like thunder that promises rain. The peasants who circle him move with abandon that their parish priest would condemn as satanic, their bodies following rhythms older than Christian chant, their voices raised in songs that carry no Latin words, but somehow make the barley fields shimmer with promise of abundance. This is Perchta's night, the feast of the wild hunt, the celebration that connects winter's death to spring's resurrection through mysteries that the Church has spent 3 centuries trying to eliminate. But elimination has proved impossible, so transformation begins instead. What cannot be destroyed must be demonized. What cannot be forgotten must be feared. What cannot be killed must be reborn as enemy. By morning, the dancers will confess their sins to priests who impose penances with trembling hands. The horned figure will be remembered not as the fertility god who blessed their ancestors' fields for 1,000 years, but as Satan himself, the fallen angel whose temptations led innocent Christians into diabolic worship. The celebration that ensured another year's harvest will be recorded in episcopal registers as evidence of demonic possession, requiring exorcism and extended prayer. But the barley will still grow. The cattle will still calve in spring. The seasonal cycles will continue to turn according to rhythms that acknowledge no episcopal authority, that respond to partnerships maintained through ritual attention, that Christian doctrine condemns, while Christian survival depends on its continuation. The transformation of gods into demons follows patterns established by theological necessity rather than spiritual truth. Powers too essential to eliminate, too deeply embedded in cultural practice to eradicate, too connected to survival needs to abandon, must be reclassified as evil to maintain Christian claims to exclusive spiritual authority while preserving the functions that communities cannot survive without. The process requires careful attention to maintaining effectiveness while reversing moral valuation. The fertility god who ensures abundant harvests becomes the devil who tempts souls to damnation through participation in ancient rites that produce the food Christian communities need to survive. The healing goddess who dispenses medicine through sacred springs becomes the witch who poisons wells with diabolic potions that happen to cure ailments that Christian prayer cannot address. The forest spirits who provide guidance to travelers become demons who lead innocent wayfarers astray through landscapes that remain safely navigable, only for those who know the proper protocols for spiritual negotiation. The Malleus Maleficarum, that encyclopedia of feminine damnation compiled by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger in 1487, provides the most systematic documentation of how ancient gods were transformed into diabolic entities whose worship became capital crimes against Christian civilization. But beneath its theological condemnations and legal prescriptions, the text preserves detailed descriptions of practices that reveal the continued operation of pre-Christian religious systems, whose effectiveness the authors cannot deny, while claiming that their power derives from satanic rather than divine sources. The witches whose activities the Malleus catalogues are not practitioners of a new diabolic religion, but inheritors of ancient traditions that connected human communities to environmental intelligence through consciousness technologies that Christianity could not absorb without acknowledging forms of spiritual authority that challenged ecclesiastical monopoly on divine communication. Their Sabbaths are seasonal festivals whose timing follows agricultural cycles rather than Christian calendar. Their magic operates through partnerships with plant and animal consciousness that provide information about weather patterns, healing protocols, and ecological relationships essential for community survival. But their knowledge makes them dangerous to religious authorities, who claim exclusive access to spiritual power while depending on the continuation of ancient practices that their theology officially condemns. The solution is demonization, the reclassification of essential community functions as diabolic activities whose practitioners must be eliminated to protect Christian souls from supernatural corruption. The witch trials that swept across Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods were not religious persecution, but strategic warfare against knowledge systems that threatened ecclesiastical authority by demonstrating that effective spiritual practice required partnership with environmental intelligence rather than submission to institutional doctrine. The women who died at the stakes were not devil worshippers, but the last practitioners of consciousness technologies that had sustained European communities for millennia, before Christianity taught them to seek salvation in heavenly realms, while ignoring the sacred intelligence that operated through earthly landscapes. The confessions extracted through torture document practices that reveal the sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that the accused possessed. They describe rituals for communicating with weather patterns, techniques for enhancing agricultural productivity, methods for healing ailments through partnerships with plant consciousness, and ceremonies for maintaining community cohesion through connection to ancestral wisdom that had guided tribal survival for countless generations. But the same confessions also reveal how thoroughly these ancient practices had been transformed by the demonization process. The weather goddesses, who had once been honored as essential partners in agricultural success, were now described as diabolic entities who demanded soul surrender in exchange for meteorological cooperation. The healing spirits who had provided medicine through sacred plants were reclassified as demons who required blasphemous rituals in return for therapeutic knowledge. The ancestral guides who had offered wisdom through dreams and vision were transformed into satanic tempters whose communications led souls toward eternal damnation. The transformation was not arbitrary, but followed precise theological requirements. Christianity could not acknowledge the existence of autonomous spiritual entities that operated independently of divine authority without undermining its claims to exclusive mediation between human souls and cosmic power. But it could recognize diabolic forces whose existence confirmed Christian cosmology while explaining the effectiveness of non-Christian spiritual practices. The result was a theological system that preserved ancient functions while inverting their moral significance, that maintained essential relationships while condemning them as evil, that continued to benefit from environmental partnerships while claiming that such benefits came at the cost of eternal salvation. But inversion is not elimination, and the powers that were reclassified as demons retained their original nature and capabilities despite their changed theological status. The fertility spirits who ensured agricultural abundance continued to respond to proper ritual attention, regardless of whether their human partners called them gods or devils. The healing entities who provided medicine through plant consciousness continued to dispense therapeutic knowledge to those who approached them with appropriate respect and offering. The demonization process created theological contradictions that revealed themselves through the continued effectiveness of condemned practices. Communities that eliminated traditional relationships with fertility spirits experienced crop failures that Christian prayer could not prevent. Regions that suppressed ancient healing traditions suffered from diseases that ecclesiastical medicine could not cure. Areas that abandoned seasonal festivals found themselves vulnerable to climatic extremes that their ancestors had known how to moderate through ritual partnership with atmospheric intelligence. The solution was practical rather than theological. Maintain the ancient practices while condemning them as necessary evils. Continue the essential relationships while claiming they were diabolic temptations that virtuous Christians must resist, even while depending on their continuation for survival. The result was cultural schizophrenia that divided European consciousness between official Christian doctrine and practical pagan implementation, between heavenly aspirations and earthly necessities, between theological theory and ecological reality. The folklore that emerged from this tension preserves the memory of transformation while documenting its incompleteness. The fairy tales collected by the Brothers Grimm catalogue encounters with entities whose descriptions reveal their origins as degraded memories of ancient gods whose worship had been driven underground but never entirely eliminated. The forest spirits who appear as helpful guides in some stories and dangerous tempters in others reflect the theological confusion created by demonization processes that transformed essential community partners into moral threats while preserving their functional capabilities. Perchta, the Germanic goddess who regulated seasonal transitions and agricultural cycles, survives in folklore as both benevolent gift-giver and terrifying punisher, whose mood depends on whether communities maintain proper attention to seasonal observances. Her dual nature reflects the incomplete demonization that allowed her essential functions to continue while investing them with moral ambiguity that discouraged direct worship while preserving practical relationship. The wild hunt that she leads through winter nights carries souls who have failed to honor seasonal transitions properly, but it also ensures the continuation of natural cycles that sustain life through the dark months when survival depends on partnerships with powers that operate beyond human control. Her punishment of lazy spinners and reward of industrious workers reflects ancient economic relationships that connected human productivity to environmental abundance through ritual attention that maintained ecological balance. But the folklore also preserves memory of her original nature as protective deity whose authority ensured community survival through cooperative relationships that honored both human needs and environmental requirements. The bread she blesses feeds families through winter shortages. The flax she inspires becomes clothing that protects against climatic extremes. The seasonal wisdom she teaches through dreams and omens guides communities through transitions that could destroy those who failed to recognize their approach. The transformation of Perchta from goddess to folklore figure illustrates the broader pattern through which European consciousness adapted to demonization pressures while preserving essential functions. The ancient gods could not be worshipped openly without risking persecution, but they could be acknowledged indirectly through stories that maintained memory of their capabilities while disguising direct relationship as entertainment or cultural tradition. The May Day celebrations that continued throughout the medieval period, despite ecclesiastical condemnation, preserved fertility rituals whose effectiveness communities could not afford to abandon, even while officially accepting Christian claims that such practices served diabolic purposes. The bonfires that blazed on hillsides across Europe connected communities to solar consciousness that regulated agricultural cycles through partnerships that predated Christian influence by millennia. But the participants who danced around these fires were careful to frame their activities as folk customs rather than religious practices, as cultural traditions rather than spiritual worship, as harmless entertainment rather than serious engagement with powers that Christianity had reclassified as demonic threats to eternal salvation. The maypole that rose at the center of these celebrations carried within its symbolism the memory of the cosmic axis that connected earthly communities to stellar intelligence, but its dancers could claim they were simply following traditional customs whose spiritual significance had been forgotten, even while their bodies moved in patterns that maintained ancient communication protocols with environmental consciousness. The Green Man, whose face appeared in cathedral carvings throughout Christian Europe, embodied the persistent presence of forest consciousness that no amount of theological condemnation could eliminate from landscapes where human survival depended on partnership with woodland intelligence. But his appearance in Christian architecture allowed communities to maintain visual connection to green consciousness while claiming that such imagery served purely decorative purposes rather than facilitating ongoing spiritual relationship. The contradiction became visible during periods of agricultural crisis, when communities discovered that Christian prayer alone could not address environmental problems that required partnership with intelligence systems that church doctrine condemned as diabolic. The famines that periodically devastated medieval Europe often ended only when communities secretly resumed ancient practices that restored their relationships with agricultural spirits, whose cooperation was essential for restoring abundance. But such resumption required extreme caution because the same practices that ended famine could result in persecution for witchcraft if observed by ecclesiastical authorities who recognized their effectiveness but attributed their power to diabolic sources that threatened Christian souls, even while preserving Christian bodies. The calendars that guided agricultural activities throughout the medieval period preserved ancient timing that connected farming operations to stellar cycles, lunar phases, and seasonal transitions that reflected the astronomical knowledge embedded in pre-Christian worship practices. But farmers who followed these schedules were careful to claim that their timing reflected practical experience rather than spiritual partnership, natural observation rather than supernatural communication. The herbalism that provided medicine for communities that lacked access to trained physicians preserved knowledge of plant consciousness that had sustained European healing traditions for thousands of years before Christianity arrived. But healers who possessed this knowledge were forced to disguise their partnership with plant intelligence as empirical observation rather than spiritual communication, as natural philosophy rather than supernatural collaboration. The result was the development of dual consciousness systems that allowed communities to maintain essential relationships with environmental intelligence, while officially accepting Christian doctrine that condemned such relationships as diabolic temptations. European culture became fundamentally split between surface Christianity that acknowledged only divine authority, mediated through ecclesiastical hierarchy, and underground paganism that preserved the ancient partnerships essential for survival in landscapes that responded to ritual attention rather than theological doctrine. But splits eventually become cracks, and cracks eventually become fractures that reveal the contradictions they were created to conceal. The scientific revolution that transformed European intellectual culture during the early modern period emerged from attempts to resolve the tension between Christian theology and practical knowledge that required partnership with natural intelligence systems, that church doctrine condemned while Christian survival depended on their continuation. The natural philosophers who laid the foundations for modern science were not eliminating superstition, but seeking forms of environmental partnership that could operate without theological authorization, that could acknowledge natural intelligence without invoking diabolic intervention, that could maintain essential relationships while avoiding persecution for practices that Christianity had reclassified as witchcraft. But their solution created new problems by treating environmental intelligence as mechanical process rather than conscious entity, by seeking to control natural systems rather than partner with them, by reducing ecological relationships to technical procedures rather than maintaining them as spiritual partnerships that required ongoing attention to balance, reciprocity, and mutual respect. The demons that Christianity created from ancient gods did not disappear when science replaced theology as the dominant intellectual framework for understanding natural phenomena. They migrated into the psychological realm, where they continue to operate as shadow aspects of consciousness that modern culture cannot acknowledge, without admitting that its rational worldview depends on the suppression of awareness capabilities that earlier generations possessed, but contemporary society has systematically eliminated. The ecological crisis that accelerates through the current era reflects the consequences of consciousness technologies that operate through domination rather than partnership, through control rather than cooperation, through mechanical manipulation rather than spiritual relationship. The environmental intelligence that was demonized during the medieval period and mechanized during the scientific revolution continues to operate according to its original parameters, but now without human partnership that could moderate its responses to industrial activities that treat natural systems as resources rather than recognizing them as conscious entities that require respectful negotiation. The old gods who became demons are stirring again in landscapes that can no longer sustain the forms of exploitation that replaced their ancient partnerships with human communities. The fertility spirits who were condemned as diabolic tempters are withdrawing their cooperation from agricultural systems that operate through chemical domination rather than ecological relationship. The weather consciousness that was reclassified as demonic is responding to atmospheric disruption with climatic instability that reflects the breakdown of partnerships that once moderated environmental extremes through ritual attention that maintained balance between human activities and natural systems. But stirring is not vengeance, and the powers that were demonized by theological necessity retain their essential nature as partners rather than enemies, as teachers rather than tempters, as sources of wisdom rather than spiritual corruption. Their apparent hostility reflects human failure to maintain relationships that require acknowledgement, respect, and ongoing attention to balance and reciprocity. The demons are offering to become gods again, but the offer requires abandoning the consciousness technologies that treat environmental intelligence as enemy to be conquered rather than partner to be honored, that seek to control natural systems rather than cooperate with them, that pursue domination rather than seeking sustainable relationship. The choice belongs to human consciousness that has developed beyond the limitations that made demonization seem necessary, that can acknowledge environmental intelligence without threatening theological authority that no longer claims exclusive spiritual jurisdiction, that can resume ancient partnerships while incorporating contemporary understanding of ecological complexity that early practitioners could only access through mythological language. The horned god is dancing again in forests that remember his original blessings. The seasonal festivals are stirring in communities that need their gifts more desperately than their medieval ancestors ever did. The wild hunt is gathering in skies that carry messages about climatic changes that require responses based on partnership rather than domination. But the dance requires human participation. The festivals need human celebration. The hunt demands human partnership in forms of environmental relationship that acknowledge the consciousness that operates through natural systems and recognize the intelligence that regulates ecological balance across scales that individual human minds cannot comprehend alone. The demons are ready to remember their divine nature, but memory requires recognition. And recognition demands the courage to acknowledge that the powers Christianity demonized were never evil. They were simply too essential to eliminate, too powerful to control, too connected to survival to abandon. They wait for the fear to end and the partnership to begin again. The May Queen wears flowers in her hair that no florist could name. They bloom for one day only, appearing in hedgerows and meadows across the English countryside, as if summoned by the dancing that begins at dawn and continues until the sun reaches its zenith. By evening, the petals have fallen, leaving no trace except the memory of colors that seem too vivid for this diminished world. The children who crown her with these impossible blossoms know nothing of the goddess whose role she plays, cannot pronounce the names that once commanded harvests, have never heard the prayers that made the flowers bloom. They follow rhythms that live in their blood like ancestral memories, their feet finding patterns that connect them to dancers who have turned to dust, but whose movements still echo through the land, like songs that the earth itself remembers. This is how the gods survive when their names are forgotten, through actions that outlive understanding, through rituals that preserve their essence while losing their meaning, through ceremonies that maintain ancient connections to powers whose identities have dissolved into folklore, into half-remembered songs, into the instinctive knowledge that certain days require celebration and certain places demand reverence. The maypole that rises at the center of the village green stands where a standing stone once marked the axis between earth and sky, where druids calculated the movements of celestial bodies and villagers gathered to renew their contracts with the spirits that governed seasonal abundance. The stone is gone, quarried for church foundations centuries ago, but the spot still pulses with energy that makes children's laughter ring clearer, makes flowers bloom brighter, makes the boundary between ordinary time and sacred time grow thin enough to step through. The Morris dancers who leap around the pole wear bells that sing in frequencies older than their tradition. their handkerchiefs fluttering like prayer flags that carry messages to atmospheric intelligence that still responds to proper rhythm and movement. They know nothing of the hunting magic their steps once powered, cannot explain why their dances follow patterns that map stellar movements, have no conscious awareness that their performance maintains ancient agreements between human communities and the weather consciousness that determines whether crops will thrive or fail. But their bodies know. Their feet find the sacred geometry without guidance. Their movements channel energies that flow through ley lines, connecting stone circles to holy wells, to the burial mounds, where forgotten kings sleep beneath hills that still remember their true names. In Ireland, where memory runs deeper than English ploughs ever reached, the fairy forts that dot the landscape like green jewels preserve more than folklore. These circular earthworks mark the dwelling places of the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race that ruled before human feet touched Irish soil, before iron replaced bronze, before the old contracts between mortal consciousness and immortal wisdom were renegotiated through conquest rather than cooperation. The farmers who graze their cattle in fields surrounding these ancient structures know better than to disturb the raised rings, where no grass grows quite the same color as the surrounding pasture. They tell stories of tractors that break down when they approach too close, of animals that refuse to enter the circles, of sounds that rise from the earth on quiet nights, music that belongs to no human tradition, voices that speak in languages that predated human speech. These are not superstitions, but survival protocols preserved through generations that learned the hard way that certain places require respectful distance, that some boundaries should not be crossed, that the powers that built these monuments continue to inhabit them despite the collapse of the civilizations that once knew their proper names and functions. The children who play near these sites develop different skills than their urban cousins: sharper intuition, deeper connection to weather patterns, uncanny ability to find lost objects and avoid dangerous situations. Their parents dismiss these abilities as countryside practicality, but older residents remember when such gifts were recognized as the first signs of talent that could be trained into partnership with intelligences that operate beyond ordinary perception. The sacred wells that bubble throughout Celtic lands still draw pilgrims who tie rags to hawthorn trees and leave coins in waters that have never ceased to flow, never changed temperature, never failed to provide healing for ailments that resist conventional treatment. The saints whose names these wells now bear are recent additions to much older stories. Christian labels attached to healing springs that were sacred long before St. Bridget was born, long before St. Patrick arrived, long before the first monastery was built on Irish soil. The water knows the difference. The springs respond to older names, whispered by pilgrims who learned them from grandmothers, who remembered when such knowledge was passed openly rather than hidden beneath Christian prayers. The healings that occur at these sites follow patterns that connect them to ancient goddess worship rather than medieval saint veneration, earth energies channeled through geological formations that predate religious doctrine by millions of years. But the most persistent echoes of the old gods survive in the seasonal celebrations that no amount of Christian rebranding has ever fully transformed. Halloween preserves Samhain, the Celtic New Year, when the boundary between worlds dissolves and the ancestors walk among the living. Christmas incorporates Yule, the solstice celebration that honors the sun's return from its darkest exile. Easter builds upon spring festivals that celebrated the earth goddess's resurrection from winter death. These Christian holidays carry within their timing and customs the DNA of much older observances, genetic codes that preserve ancient knowledge in forms that survive theological transformation while maintaining essential functions. The jack-o'-lanterns that grin from doorsteps on Halloween night are simplified versions of the skulls that once marked spirit pathways. The Christmas tree that sparkles in modern living rooms descends from the world tree, whose branches connected earthly consciousness to stellar intelligence. The eggs that children hunt on Easter morning echo the cosmic egg from which the Earth Goddess hatched each spring's new life. But preservation through folklore is imperfect, like messages transmitted through static, that arrives garbled but still recognizable to those who know what to listen for. The Morris dancers perform their ancient patterns, but they no longer consciously channel the energies their movements once directed. The seasonal festivals continue their celebrations, but they no longer deliberately maintain the partnerships that their observance once renewed. The result is cultural haunting, the persistence of forms whose animating spirit has withdrawn, the continuation of practices whose original purpose has been forgotten. The gods continue to echo through human activities, but the echoes grow fainter with each generation that participates without understanding, that performs without believing, that maintains traditions as entertainment, rather than recognizing them as technologies of consciousness that connect human awareness to environmental intelligence. Yet even faded echoes carry enough information for reconstruction. The archaeological excavations that uncover temple foundations beneath church floors, the linguistic research that traces Christian terminology back to pagan origins, the ethnographic studies that document surviving folk practices, all contribute to a growing understanding of what was lost and what might still be recovered. In remote valleys of Romania, where industrial development never reached, where television arrived only recently, where grandmothers still remember songs their own grandmothers sang, researchers find intact fragments of pre-Christian worship that preserve not just the forms but the consciousness technologies that made them effective. The healing rituals still work. The weather magic still functions. The plant partnerships still provide medicine that surpasses anything available through conventional channels. These survivors carry forward more than cultural memory. They maintain active relationships with environmental intelligence that most of the world assumes died with the gods who once mediated such partnerships. They demonstrate that the ancient consciousness technologies remain operational, that the environmental intelligence continues to respond to proper approach, that the partnerships can be renewed by those willing to learn protocols that require humility rather than domination. But they also reveal how much has been lost. The complete systems that once coordinated entire civilizations through partnership with planetary intelligence have fragmented into isolated practices maintained by scattered individuals who lack the community support that made ancient Earth wisdom fully effective. The survivors preserve individual techniques rather than integrated technologies, personal relationships rather than cultural infrastructures, fragments rather than the vast networks of consciousness partnership that once sustained entire continents. The climate crisis that accelerates through the current era demonstrates the consequences of this fragmentation. Weather patterns that followed predictable cycles for millennia now shift chaotically as atmospheric intelligence responds to industrial activities, without the moderating influence of human partnership that once maintained balance between technological capability and ecological wisdom. The environmental systems that sustained human civilization for thousands of years are breaking down as the consciousness technologies that maintain them disappear from human memory. But breakdown creates opportunities for rebuilding, and the current crisis is forcing recognition that technological solutions alone cannot address problems that require partnership with intelligent systems that operate beyond human control. The ancient gods who were forgotten, absorbed, demonized, and fragmented into folklore are stirring again as human consciousness begins to acknowledge forms of environmental intelligence that materialist science cannot recognize, but ecological survival increasingly demands. The revival is not nostalgic recreation, but evolutionary development. The integration of ancient consciousness technologies with contemporary understanding of ecological complexity. The environmental partnerships that sustained pre-industrial civilizations are being rediscovered and adapted for application to challenges that require cooperation between human intelligence and the planetary consciousness that regulates climate systems, biodiversity patterns, and the complex networks of relationships that determine whether Earth remains habitable for technological civilization. The children who dance around maypoles without knowing why are unconsciously preparing for futures that will require conscious partnership with environmental intelligence. The farmers who respect fairy forts without understanding their purpose are preserving access to landscape consciousness that may prove essential for agricultural adaptation to changing climate conditions. The pilgrims who seek healing at sacred wells are maintaining connections to earth energies that could become crucial as conventional medical systems prove inadequate for treating ailments that arise from environmental disruption. The old gods are not dead, they are dormant, waiting for human consciousness to develop beyond the limitations that made their suppression seem necessary, that made domination seem preferable to partnership, that made control seem safer than cooperation. They wait in the folklore that preserves their echoes, in the landscapes that remember their presence, in the seasonal cycles that continue their ancient work, despite human neglect of the partnerships that once consciously supported their activities. They wait for the conversations to resume, for the rituals to remember their purposes, for the celebrations to recover their consciousness-transforming power. They wait for human intelligence to acknowledge that survival in an interconnected world requires partnership with forms of consciousness that operate through environmental systems too complex for any single species to manage alone. The children are dancing, the flowers are blooming, the earth is stirring with memories of what was lost and possibilities of what could be recovered. The old gods are waking up, ready to teach again the technologies of consciousness that their human partners will need to navigate futures that require cooperation rather than conquest, relationship rather than domination, partnership rather than control. But waking requires recognition. And recognition demands the courage to acknowledge that the rational materialism that replaced ancient Earth wisdom was not progress, but regression. A simplification that traded long-term sustainability for short-term control. That sacrificed wisdom for knowledge. That chose power over partnership. The gods are stirring in the places where they never fully departed. And sometimes, when the ancient celebrations achieve the proper intensity, when the seasonal alignments recreate conditions that the original temples were built to recognize, when individual human consciousness develops the sensitivity necessary to detect signals that have never stopped transmitting, the conversations resume. Brief fragments, broken connections, partial downloads of information too vast for current human neurology to process completely, but enough to remember what was lost, enough to recognize what could still be recovered, enough to understand that the future of human civilization may depend on rediscovering the consciousness technologies that sustained ancient partnerships between human intelligence and the environmental awareness that regulates planetary systems. The old gods are gone. But sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees, when the flowers bloom in impossible colors, when the children dance to rhythms that their bodies remember but their minds cannot explain, they remember your name. And they are calling you home to conversations that never really ended, to partnerships that wait for renewal, to relationships that could transform crisis into opportunity and separation into connection. The echo is fading, but the voice that created it has never been silent. Listen, remember, begin again.